Abolition. Today.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
In 1845, Fredrick Douglass, the great American abolitionist, published the first of what would become 3 autobiographical accounts of his life. The first one was called Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American Slave. Fredrick Douglass is, of course, one of the greatest Americans of all time. His autobiography is about life as a slave and his struggle to become free. In addition to everything else he did in his life, those written works are some of the most influential written American accounts of anything on any subject. In Narrative of the Life, which is the most widely read of the 3 of his 3 autobiographical accounts, but also in the subsequent autobiographies he wrote as well, including the next one, My Bondage and My Freedom. One of the most harrowing things Fredrick Douglass describes about his own life is a year-long period when the man who owned him as a slave decided that young Fredrick Douglass was incorrigible. Douglass's owner decided that Fredrick Douglass needed, in effect, to be tamed, to be broken. And so he shipped Fredrick Douglass off to a man who is literally known as a slave breaker. The slave breaker was named Edward Covey, C-O-V-E-Y. This is part of how Fredrick Douglass describes him in My Bondage and My Freedom. He says, quote, I had now lived with him, meaning his slave owner, nearly 9 months, and he had given me a number of severe whippings without any visible improvement in my character or my conduct. Now he was resolved to put me out, as he said, quote, to be broken. There was, in the Bayside, a man named Edward Covey who enjoyed the execrated reputation of being a first-rate hand at breaking young Negroes. Breaking. Fredrick Douglass then goes on in chapter after chapter after chapter in this autobiography. Look at this, the experiences at Covey's, unusual brutality of Covey, driven back to Covey's, Covey's manner of proceeding to whip, right? Goes in chapter after chapter after chapter, he describes this experience, the way that Edward Covey tortured him and beat him nearly to death and worked him nearly to death, all to try to destroy Fredrick Douglass's spirit, to try to destroy his mind, to turn him into a docile slave who would work without question, whereupon he would then be returned to his owner. And because Fredrick Douglass is so capable and so brilliant, his own recounting in his autobiographies of what happened to him in that period of his life, what happened to him when his slave owner sent him to Edward Covey, what happened to him at Edward Covey's hands, what happened to him while he stayed for a year at Edward Covey's farm, and Covey was tasked there with breaking him. Because Fredrick Douglass is such a luminous, important, brilliant, inspiring, incredible figure, unparalleled figure in American history, because of what we know he is capable of, because we know what his mind was capable of and what he did for his country in his life. When he recounts what happened to him at the hands of Edward Covey, it is the most dispiriting and desolate and just miserable thing that Douglass writes about. He said, I shall never be able to narrate the mental experience through which it was my lot to pass during my stay at Edward Covey's. I was completely wrecked, changed and bewildered, goaded almost to madness at one time, and at another reconciling myself to my wretched condition. I suffered bodily as well as mentally, he says. The overwork and the brutal chastisements of which I was the victim, combined with that ever-gnawing and soul-devouring thought, I am a slave for life, a slave with no rational ground to hope for freedom. It rendered me a living embodiment of mental and physical wretchedness. That was Fredrick Douglass's account of his own life in that lowest period in his own life. And that written account did more than any other to galvanize the American abolitionist movement to bring an end to slavery. And of course, it was not fiction. It really happened, and it really happened just as Fredrick Douglass said it did. And Edward Covey was a real person who really did operate a slave-breaking operation at his farm, to which Fredrick Douglass was sent. Now, if you go back to that initial description, Douglass describes Covey's farm as being on the bay side. What he meant by that was that the farm was on the far side of Chesapeake Bay, from the mainland of Maryland, which is where Douglass was being sent there from. Edward Covey's farm, his slave-breaking operation where he tortured Fredrick Douglass and countless others, was this house and its surrounding farmland on the eastern shore of Maryland in a town that's now called St. Michael's. The farm and the house at the farm itself had a name, a fitting name. It was called Mount Misery. About 15 years ago now, a literature professor wrote a very thoughtful piece in the Baltimore Sun newspaper suggesting a new future for Mount Misery, suggesting that the United States of America should consider buying Mount Misery to make it a commemorative site. He argued, would not the most fitting outcome for Mount Misery be as a monument or museum, wherein a key moment from the country's past can find its rightful place in the public memory? The old Edward Covey house deserves our understanding and preservation. The fight between slave and slave breaker that took place there is emblematic of two of the elemental themes of American history: the horrors of legally sanctioned racial violence, and also the nobility of the struggle against it. And then here's actually the kicker from that piece. The professor says, quote, preserving Mount Misery as a public site of contemplation where the meanings of democracy and despotism are given a human face also would help keep St. Michael's from being merely a resort for the wealthy. A resort for the wealthy? Now check this out. The occasion for that call, that well-argued piece in the Baltimore Sun that Mount Misery should be purchased and preserved by this country as a monument to the epic violence committed there against slaves in great numbers, but specifically against one of the greatest Americans of all time. The key role that the torture in that house played in turning on our American conscience to eventually overthrow slavery. The occasion for that call to preserve Mount Misery as a monument to the hell that happened there. The reason the Baltimore Sun published that just less than 15 years ago now was this revelation that was published in the New York Times exactly 15 years ago today. On June 30th, 2006, it's titled Weekends with the President's Men. It was kind of a kicky sidebar piece in the New York Times that was published in the summer of 2006. And that piece revealed that that site on the eastern shore of Maryland, Mount Misery, that house, that farm, had actually been recently purchased and was now being lived in as a private home. Can you imagine, right? I mean, first of all, the house is still called Mount Misery today. That's still the name by which it is known. Who would want to live in a place called Mount Misery? Then you get to the reason that it's called Mount Misery, right? It was the home. It was the actual home. It's the same building that's been standing there since 1804. Fredrick Douglass was tortured there in 1833 and 1834. It's the same actual physical place in which the great Fredrick Douglass was tortured and beaten and worked nearly to death every day for a year. Whether or not you think that place should be purchased by this country and made into a memorial for the worst, most violent evils of slavery and their role in turning on Americans' conscience to end slavery, right? And that's a substantive and interesting proposal. Whether or not you're into that idea, would you want to live there yourself? Would you like to wake up there in the morning and plan breakfast? Have that be your home? Who would do that? That article, published in the New York Times 15 years ago today, was actually controversial at the time that it was published because in writing that piece, it did reveal the exact home address of a senior government official who, in fact, had made Mount Misery his private home. His name was Donald Rumsfeld. And he was, at the time, summer of 2006, struggling to the end of his disastrous tenure as Secretary of Defense under the George W. Bush administration. He lived at the time at Mount Misery. He bought the place in 2003 as he was leading the nation into the invasion of Iraq. That was where he went to get away from Washington while running 2 disastrous wars. He liked to have the Chinook helicopter drop him off at the slave breakers' home where Fredrick Douglass was nearly tortured to death. He could really relax there. Donald Rumsfeld died today at the age of 88.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
Abolition today. 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 Today.